This podcast talks about some common misconceptions related to bill amendments. One misconception is that an urgency clause can be added to any bill upon a vote of the requisite number of legislators. Under Article 4, Section 8D of the Constitution, however, an urgency statute is not allowed to create or abolish any office. An urgency statute can't change the salary, the term, or the duties of any office. Also, an urgency clause cannot grant any franchise or special privilege. In addition, an urgency clause cannot create any vested right or interest. So an urgency clause cannot be added to any bill. Another misconception is that a bill returning on concurrence can be amended. However, a bill cannot be amended when it returns to its house of origin for a concurrence vote. The amendments can be made in the house of origin before it leaves the house of origin, or an amendment can be made in the other house. But when the bill returns, the only vote available is to concur or not concur in the amendments made by the other house. Another misconception is that submitting bill amendments is the same process in both houses. However, the Assembly requires amendments to be submitted by 5 p.m. or the close of session the day before the amendment deadline. And then the next day, those amendments are taken up by the author of the bill or the floor manager of the bill and adopted by a majority of those present and voting. The Senate does not have the same rule, and they simply process the amendments through the end of the day or the close of session on the amendment deadline date. Another misconception is that committees adopt bill amendments, but committees actually make recommendations that a bill be passed with the proposed amendments, and it's the floor that adopts those amendments to a bill or another legislative measure. Another misconception is that bill amendments need a majority vote of a committee or a majority vote of the members on the floor in order to be properly adopted. However, amendments to a legislative measure, a bill, a resolution, or a constitutional amendment are made or can be made by a majority vote of those present and voting rather than a majority of the committee members or a majority of those on the floor of the Assembly or Senate. Another misconception is that a bill cannot be amended during the 30 days following its introduction. That is the rule on the Senate side. The Senate does follow that. However, the Assembly has a slightly different interpretation of the 30-day waiting period in Article 4, Section 8A of the state constitution. Once a bill has been referred to committee, the Assembly permits pre-committee authors amendments to bills within that 30-day period. The Senate, again, doesn't allow this. Another misconception is that all amendments must be germane to the original bill or legislative measure. Now, technically, that is true. However, germaneness is determined on the floor by a majority vote of the House's membership. So according to the rules, legislative council may be asked to opine on germaneness, but ultimately that determination is subject to a vote of the full Assembly or the Senate Committee on Rules. Another misconception is that the requirement that substantially amended bills have to be returned to Policy Committee. Under Senate Rule 2910, this requirement applies to all bills except the budget bill. And under Assembly Rule 77.2, it is discretionary for the Speaker to return a substantially amended bill to a policy committee for additional hearing. Another misconception is that a conference committee cannot approve substantial policy changes if the proposed changes were defeated in a policy committee. Now, this is the general rule in the California Legislature. However, it doesn't apply to the budget bill or any budget trailer bills. The substantial policy change had to have been defeated in policy committee also during the current legislative session. And you can see this as outlined in Assembly Rule 68.9 subdivision A. There's also a misconception that floor amendments may be made at any time, but there are in fact some limitations to making floor amendments. For example, under Assembly Rule 69, a motion to amend on the floor is not in order during the last 2 days before the January 31st deadline, or the last 7 days before the interim recess or the final recess, unless Assembly Rule 69 is suspended by a 2/3 vote. Now, this rule does not apply to adding or deleting an urgency clause or adopting double jointing amendments that attempt to address any chaptering out problems. One other misconception is that an urgency clause can be added at any time. However, if it is not in the originally introduced version, then the Rules Committee has to grant prior approval.